The Middle East, at the crossroads of three continents, the sacred home of three religions, a land of ancient conflicts, still the center of a desperate struggle. The state of Israel, committed to survival, her Arab neighbors committed to her destruction. Beneath the sand, the world's richest supply of oil, fueling the rivalry of the superpowers. In the 1970s, the leaders of three nations cut through age-old hatreds and modern tensions to forge a treaty of peace. The man who made the first move was the President of Egypt. This is the story of the struggle for peace led by Anwar Sadat. He turned his back on history and the wishes of the nation he led to begin the struggle for peace. Sadat gambled with destiny and lost his life in the process, cut down by assassins' bullets. Through it all, ABC News was there. Watch now the original ABC News broadcasts of a great TV news story, Death on the Nile, the struggle for peace, and the assassination of Anwar Sadat. From ABC News, great TV news stories. With Frank Reynolds, Peter Jennings, Ted Koppel, Barbara Walters, Sam Donaldson, Hugh Downs, Tom Jarrell, Harry Reisner, Howard K. Smith, and the worldwide resources of ABC News.
For the past 1,000 years, nobody in the West has bothered very much about getting along with the Arabs. They haven't amounted to very much. In the past 12 months, however, it's become a very big matter, not far on our agenda below getting along with Russia or getting along with China. There are about 100 million Arabs in about 20 Arab countries. Though they're not united and none is dominant, the most prestigious is Egypt because it is the most populous. It's a piece of luck for us that the president of Egypt now is Anwar el-Sadat.
Sadat the villager, Sadat the passionate nationalist, came to power suddenly. Though perhaps only he felt it for certain, his emergence as an Arab leader of note began the day that Nasser died in 1970.
You know, we thought at one time this man will never die. And because we were in such a mess, and we were humiliated, and we were injured, we have put all our burden on the shoulders of Nasser.
Sadat as president faced many of the same problems which had existed at the time of the revolution. The British had long ago signed an agreement to leave Egypt, but there were still foreign troops on Egyptian soil. Since the June War of 1967, the Israelis had occupied virtually all of Sinai. Sadat knew he must deal with Israeli occupation, but first he moved to establish his credentials at home.
What had been rumored all day was officially confirmed this evening. President Anwar Sadat of Egypt has told the Soviet Union to withdraw its estimated 20,000 military advisors and technicians from his country. Sadat said that from now on, Egyptian forces will operate the complex missile systems and other military installations that the Russians have set up on Egyptian soil. Only last year, Sadat had signed a long-term friendship treaty with Russia, renewing ties going back to 1956. Sadat's action, which set off all sorts of speculation as to motive, caught Washington officials off guard.
Sadat's decision to expel the Russians was warmly received at home. Sadat hoped that when the Russians left, President Nixon would exert more pressure on Israel for withdrawal. With no response, Sadat laid his plans for the October War. The world was surprised at Sadat's decisiveness. The Israelis were surprised, even though they had seen Sadat move boldly in the first 3 years of office.
The day is October 6th, 1973, the holiest day of the Jewish year, Yom Kippur. Sadat launches a surprise attack. Egypt crosses the Suez Canal into Israeli-occupied territory. Syria invades from the north.
The war in the Middle East is 9 days old now, and Egypt says its troops and tanks today opened the biggest offensive of the war so far, an offensive farther into the Sinai Desert. Egypt says her forces took more of the Sinai Desert that Israel captured in the War of 1967. But Israel says it turned back the Egyptian attack. On the other front, in Syria, Israeli troops are still marching to Damascus, and they say they're within 14 miles of the Syrian capital. But they are not moving easily. The Syrians are putting up a tough, effective defense. We have reports from the two fronts, first from ABC's Bill Siemens with the Israeli troops in the Sinai.
The Sinai front erupted at dawn with a massive Egyptian attack. Tank and artillery battles raged all day over an area stretching 100 miles along the Suez Canal.
The Israelis have continued their offensive in Syria. Those are MiGs, and that's Akak.
It was also strafing and bombing uncomfortably close. Israel did not have complete mastery of the sky in this area, as this MiG would indicate. The Israeli Air Force is most definitely playing a key role in the battle with Syria, but the battle is taking its toll. American intelligence estimates are that the Israelis may have lost as many as 90 planes in the past week. Although if Arab claims were accepted, they would have lost 469, leaving the Israeli Air Force with only 19 planes left.
Sadat maintains that his diplomatic failures left him no choice but to fight.
It was aimed as a limited operation. The land was not my aim at all. I wanted only to prove to the whole world that the Israeli theory of security would collapse, and we would cross the canal and we could capture the barley flying. These were my aims.
After 18 days and massive American aid, the Israelis throw back the invasion. But Sadat has won a political victory.
The war left Sadat as a world leader with whom other leaders had to contend. President Nixon came to call. Sadat was now critical to peace or war. Henry Kissinger trekked to his door.
Sir, to what extent do you think your personal rapport with Secretary Kissinger has been a factor in the change that you refer to?
Well, believe me, I always believe in personal contacts. And then when you find a Secretary of State who knows the full details about the problem and who is a man of trust and vision, I think we have done a lot. And our friendship and relation really is a milestone.
Well, when you first met Secretary Kissinger, did you get along well with him from the start?
Well, the first time I met him, we had a 3 hours discussion and we reached the 6 points in that meeting. I was accused by some of my Arab colleagues of surrendering everything to the United States and so. But it has been proved after that with vision, imagination, and efforts and trust, we have reached the best conclusions. And we are trying to reach the end of this problem, as I told you.
What else do you and Dr. Kissinger talk about besides business, if anything?
Because
What else do you and Dr. Kissinger talk about? Anything but business?
lots. Lots. He is a man of strategy, you know. Myself, I am a man of strategy also. So when we sit together, one can't imagine what we discuss all over the world. Not only the area here, but all over the world.
You're about to meet his new wife.
Sure, I invited her. They will be coming here.
But do you always talk business and politics with him, or do you ever talk anything in lighter moments?
Well, you know, with Dr. Kissinger, we are friends. We discuss everything. Everything as friends discuss. Business, and we lunch together, we dine together, we exchange jokes, everything.
The landslide victory of the Likud party in Israel is an enormous personal triumph for its leader, Menachem Begin. He has been running for prime minister ever since Israel was established in 1948. This week, in his 9th try, he won in what has been called in Israel a political earthquake. Now he must form a new government before he becomes prime minister. The world is waiting to see how Israel's new leader will get along with the United States and how this election will affect Arab-Israeli peace negotiations.
Sadat is an implacable enemy of Israel. This is also the truth. He is no fool, but he's an enemy.
Tensions remain high despite agreements negotiated by Henry Kissinger. Arab terrorist attacks and Israeli retaliations intensify. Israel and Egypt are again on the brink of war. The day is November 19th, 1977.
It is an unprecedented and portentous happening. Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, is about to be airborne en route to Ben Gurion Airport in the Jewish state of Israel. Among others on his plane, we believe, is Barbara Walters. We'll hear from her, and we'll hear from Peter Jennings and other correspondents in Israel. We'll see the arrival and the welcome from Prime Minister Begin. The plan and the vision for President Sadat's mission of peace began with a fear of a new war in the past few weeks, with a sudden upsurge of attacks across the border between Lebanon and Israel. ABC's diplomatic correspondent Ted Koppel tells us a story of the almost unbelievable past 10 and 11 days.
All peace initiatives in the Middle East have at least one thing in common. They are each attempts to find some alternative to this. Anwar Sadat's historic mission today is no exception. It, too, grew out of the rubble. Tuesday, November 8th. A relatively minor news story out of Tel Aviv. Responding to Palestinian rocket attacks on the town of Nahariya, Israeli artillery fires across the border into southern Lebanon. Wednesday, November 9th. The headlines become somewhat more ominous as Israeli fighter bombers streak across that same border to hit suspected guerrilla bases. Lebanese officials will later claim that over 100 civilians were killed. That same day in Cairo, President Sadat addresses the Egyptian parliament. He announces his willingness to go to Geneva with or without the Palestinians. Almost unnoticed in Sadat's speech is his offer to go anywhere in his search for peace, even Jerusalem itself. The statement is dismissed in most circles as being largely rhetorical. Thursday, November 10th. President Carter, still frustrated in his attempts to reconvene the Geneva Peace Conference, is also visibly worried that the Middle East is inching toward another war.
But the major, all-encompassing question in the Middle East is that the bloodshed, in my opinion, will not be stopped until the nations are willing to negotiate on the basic divisions that have separated them so long.
In Jerusalem, Menachem Begin picks up Sadat's offer of the previous day. Over the weekend, Begin repeats his invitation, and on Monday, November 14th, he promises to make the offer formally through U.S. diplomatic channels.
May I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I will not hesitate to write such a letter of invitation to President Sadat.
The latest and possibly the most dramatic Middle East peace initiative takes on a momentum of its own. Tuesday, November 15th. Sadat informs a group of visiting U.S. congressmen that he intends to go to the Israelis' den to tell them the truth. Wednesday, November 16th. Sadat flies to Damascus. Syrian President Assad opposes the trip to Israel. Arab opposition to the visit is almost unanimous. Sadat is caricatured as a U.S.-Israeli stooge. His own foreign minister, Ismail Fahmy, resigns in protest. Friday, November 18th. Banner headlines no longer reflect the earlier skepticism. What Sadat has described as his holy mission now seems inevitable, and the president of Egypt, a devout Muslim, prays for success.
Success may very well require divine intervention at this point because the odds are heavily stacked against Anwar Sadat. If he and the Israelis strike a separate deal, which Sadat has said he won't do, the Egyptian president will be denounced as a traitor throughout the Arab world. His political survival, possibly even his life, are already in jeopardy. But without such a separate deal, even though the climate in Egyptian-Israeli relations has undoubtedly been improved already, the fundamental issues that separate the Israelis from her Arab neighbors remain unchanged. And indeed, here at the State Department, there is as much concern as there is optimism because of the fear that Sadat's mission, which is undoubtedly a spectacular in terms of these media developments, the very coverage in which we're now engaged, that those will cause so much dissension within the Arab world that it may be more damaging to the cause of peace in the long run than helpful.
At the airport in Tel Aviv right now is Peter Jennings. Peter, what's going on there?
Well, Harry, rarely have I ever seen an airport that has so brimming over with excitement. It will not be very few minutes from now only when President Anwar Sadat comes here to make, and there is no other word for it, history. We are 30 minutes by air from Cairo. President Sadat coming directly from Cairo to Ben Gurion Airport to be met by Prime Minister Menachem Begin and the President of Israel, Ephraim Katzir. At this airport, palpable excitement. Israeli and Egyptian flags all over the place. Egyptians here. The advance party arrived just a short while ago. There is only one way, I think, to describe the intensity with which the Israelis have prepared for that, and that is to say that for 3 hours, one man with a small carpet sweeper, Harry, has been working over the red carpet on which President Sadat will set foot not very long from now. There is an enormous fascination here between the Egyptians and Israelis already here, just staring at each other, looking at the outset out of the corners of their eye, but now just waiting for Sadat to arrive.
This trip is changing a lot of things, unlocking many tensions. In the past few days, telephone calls between Israel and Egypt have become routine. Before that, there were none. Israeli banks are trading in Egyptian pounds. And last night, Barbara Walters flew from Jerusalem to Cairo on what may well have been the first commercial flight, a jet charter, between those two capitals in nearly 30 years. Now, Barbara is traveling back to Israel with President Sadat. She filed this report a little while ago before she left Cairo.
This is Barbara Walters at the Cairo airport. We have just arrived by charter jet non-stop from Israel to Egypt and have been told by Egyptian authorities that ours is the first civilian plane to fly directly from Israel to Egypt since 1948. The flight took under 2 hours. Our unique flight is, of course, just a symbol of the much larger history being made today between these two countries. President Sadat right now is at the Suez Canal zone, and we leave here shortly to join him for the flight to Israel. When we arrived at the airport, we were immediately met, our passport with their Israeli stamps approved, no trouble. Our last view of Israel were the signs at the airport saying, "Welcome, President Sadat." Our first view of Egypt, the pyramids on the sand, and then this airport with the officials and the crew as excited and as curious about our arrival as we were about them. Our next stop, Suez, then Tel Aviv. This is Barbara Walters in Cairo.
While he was getting off the plane in Tel Aviv Saturday, Sadat broke into a smile that seems to have broken the ice of formality. And at dinner tonight, the two enemy Mideast leaders looked like longtime friends. It's still a little surprising to see two men like Sadat, the Egyptian president, and Moshe Dayan, now the Israeli foreign minister. A little startling to see these two men, who fought each other for so long, exchanging light words at a dinner table.
The day is November 20th, 1977. Anwar Sadat addresses the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. Then Menachem Begin speaks.
Prime Minister Begin, unlike the Egyptian president, spoke extemporaneously. There were no concessions, neither were there from Sadat. Each quoted the prophets on many occasions.
That the Lord, creator of the world, placed our father, our joint father, in his faith, and Abraham passed this test.
The Knesset was packed. The leading figures in the Israeli state, Moshe Dayan, Abba Eban, Ariel Sharon, Golda Meir. There was only one disruption. A communist member of parliament asked to be recognized. What about the Palestinians, he demanded.
Mr. President, my parliamentary colleague of the Communist Party is interrupting me, but I am glad at this price he didn't interrupt you.
The moment passed quickly, and there was no answer. Israeli politicians listened attentively. None saw anything startling. None, it seemed, had really expected an agreement to be consummated today. The Israelis at large, perhaps expecting more, were forced to return to reality.
Within an hour after their historic joint appearance before the Knesset, President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin kept another historic appointment. Two chiefs of state, technically at war, sat down together to be interviewed by Barbara Walters. At times, they seemed to be negotiating. And that precedent-setting interview opened the way for other reporters to talk to Sadat and Begin. The two talked to Barbara for almost half an hour. This is the way it went.
I would like to, if I may, set the scene for this interview. This is taking place immediately after President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin have addressed the Knesset. We are in the Knesset itself, and this is the very first interview that President of Egypt and the Prime Minister of Israel have done, or indeed any President of Egypt and any Prime Minister. In that sense, it is historic, and we have been hoping to have this for many years, as you know, Mr. President.
Quite right.
It's something that we have talked about and talked about as well with you, Mr. Prime Minister.
Yes, ma'am.
So we are grateful to you for this historic time, the first time you're publicly appearing together for an interview. Does this mean, Mr. President, that ambassadors, that your ambassador and the Israeli ambassadors can now meet and talk, or even as you said in your speech, that they could give greetings, which they've never done before?
Well, I have stated this in my speech, and for sure I shall be conducting talks with Premier Begin tonight and tomorrow, and we shall arrange all these details.
So that after tomorrow, your ambassadors, for example, your two ambassadors in Washington, can meet and talk?
Why not?
Well, because they never have before.
It has never happened, yes. But I said today we are ready.
There should always be a beginning. And I can only express my deep satisfaction with the words uttered by the President. I do hope that starting from tomorrow, the ambassadors of Egypt and Israel all over the world will give common interviews, will meet with journalists and express their opinions, and that would apply also to the United Nations.
Would this mean that there would be an exchange of ambassadors to your two countries, an exchange of tourists, an exchange of students?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. We must reach first the ending ending of the state of belligerency in the peace agreement or peace treaty. And then after that, all this can be regulated.
I hope it will come.
Mr. President, up until yesterday, and as you suggest now, Israel and Egypt were in a state of war. Do you still consider that you are in a state of war?
Unfortunately, yes.
We want to abolish the state of war. I have, thank God, the recommendations of 3 presidents. 2 President Sadat. And as I said, this is my feeling. We really like each other. We may have differences, but we like each other.
Arab reaction to Sadat's visit is immediate and harsh.
About 1,000 Muslims came here to pray and sing in the Nasser Mosque on the edge of Ramallah, north of Jerusalem. Most of the men here were from local neighborhoods, but a small delegation of West Bank mayors showed up. In all, perhaps 24 municipal officials from as many communities came here. Rather than join Sadat at prayer in Jerusalem, they came here to protest his presence in Israel. And they chose a mosque named for Sadat's predecessor to symbolize their mistrust of his intentions. Sheikh Silwadi read passages from the Quran, but there was no mention of Sadat by this holy man nor by anybody else inside the mosque. Outside, young boys sold newspapers proclaiming Sadat's visit. The dissident Palestinian officials filed out with the Muslim faithful and lined up to shake hands with the mayor of Ramallah and his deputies in a show of solidarity. What they all want, said one, was a homeland of their own, not a separate peace between Israel and Egypt.
We want Sadat to remember it. We want everybody to remember it in case they have forgotten in the tumult of the surprise and the great shock that the visit has caused. We want to tell the world that these are our aspirations and we are solid behind it, as you have seen in the mosque this morning.
So the Palestinians protested quietly here this morning with prayers and handshakes. It appeared peaceful, much as Sadat's visit has appeared peaceful so far, despite the misgivings it has created here on the West Bank. John Martin, ABC News, Ramallah.
As Sadat spoke to the Knesset, millions of Arabs listened to live broadcasts. Afterwards, reaction was mixed. Some were enraged by Sadat's implied recognition of Israel. One Syrian said his son died for nothing in the 1973 war, since this traitor Sadat does not even care about his own blood. Others were hopeful. In Lebanon, a school teacher said they both made it clear they want to live in peace. I'm pleased. Palestinian leaders denounced Sadat. One Palestinian group in Syria called for his assassination. Criticism was harshest in the nations like Libya and Syria, most hostile to Israel.
Sadat remains in Israel 3 days. No formal agreements are made, but Sadat has shown the world Egypt intends to go forward towards peace. 1 month later, Menachem Begin visits Anwar Sadat in Egypt. The day is December 25th, 1977.
Begin came in on an LL-707 to an Egyptian military airport about 15 miles from Ismailia. He was met by an official delegation which included Egypt's vice president and its prime minister. There was not the panoply of Sadat's trip to Jerusalem, as this is a working visit, not a state visit. But its significance was nevertheless profound. Begin got into an Egyptian military helicopter, something which in itself is rather hard to believe, and was whisked away to President Sadat's villa on the Suez Canal. After a short limousine ride, the two men met, both in dark suits, both extremely conscious that the eyes not only of their people, but of the world are upon them. The two delegations wasted no time in getting down to business, with Begin and Sadat both accompanied by their defense and foreign ministers and various aides. Egyptian-Israeli issues, which are said to be virtually resolved, are secondary to the main problem, namely the Palestinians. On this issue, there are fundamental differences. However, an important aspect of the Begin plan is to include Jordan in the administration of the West Bank. And Sadat's position is that the West Bank should be linked to Jordan. So there is a basis for negotiation. While the results of the summit are not predestined, enough agreement was probably made in advance that total failure is most unlikely. Barry Dunsmore, ABC News, Ismailia.
Inevitably, November's euphoria was giving way to the old, hard realities. Jewish settlements in the Sinai. Begin's government announced it was expanding them. Sadat fired back that he would not allow a single Jewish settlement on Egyptian soil. That was early January. The next 6 months were marked by further erosion. A terrorist attack on the outskirts of Tel Aviv in early March sparks a new spiral of violence as a massive Israeli force cuts deep into Lebanon. Sporadic efforts to get direct peace talks going again fail at all levels. Finally, in July, a meeting is convened at Leeds Castle in England. In attendance, the foreign ministers of the United States, Egypt, and Israel. The meeting only serves to convince President Carter that something dramatic is required to keep the peace process from expiring altogether. Early August, the president sends his Secretary of State to the Middle East with invitations for Camp David. For 13 and a half frustrating days, the top leadership of 3 nations struggled toward compromise. For 13 of those days, success eluded them. And then, finally, it all came together. And the beaming leaders of Israel, Egypt, and the United States unveiled what they had wrought. But again, euphoria was premature. What had been achieved at Camp David was the framework of an agreement.
A few weeks later in Baghdad, an Arab summit was scathingly critical of Sadat for selling out the Arab cause and the Palestinians. The significance of this meeting was that not only the Arab hardliners, but Sadat's friends and benefactors, the Saudi Arabians, joined in the criticism. Egypt's position was further weakened by Israel's policy of wanting to increase its settlements on the West Bank. This raised questions in Egyptian minds as to how serious Israel really was about wanting a comprehensive Mideast peace. Egypt wanted to get some legal link between this treaty and the granting of autonomy to the Palestinians on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This would be Sadat's way to prove he had not sold out. But Israel saw such linkage in a different context. So far, the West Bank Palestinians have shown no inclination to even talk to the Israelis, and Israel could see Palestinian refusal to participate in any autonomy plan as a way for Egypt to back out of its treaty. This argument over linkage was and still is the fundamental stumbling block to a peace treaty. A second and related issue has sprung up within the treaty itself. Article 6, paragraph 5 states in part, in the event of a conflict between obligations of the parties under the present treaty and any of their other obligations, the obligations under this treaty will be binding and implemented. In other words, this treaty supersedes all others. Once again, this was a problem for Sadat, who has treaties with a number of Arab states. He wants to be free to go to the aid of a sister Arab state if Israel is the aggressor. Begin, of course, sees this as Sadat wanting another escape clause.
Today, with his prestige and that of his presidency at stake, President Carter arrived in Cairo to make another personal attempt to produce a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel.
The president's gamble began in Egypt, his aides insisting its outcome uncertain. He had come to Cairo to see President Sadat as the first step towards saving peace negotiations that only a few days earlier seemed to be on the verge of total collapse. Sadat, long seen by Mr. Carter as the more flexible of the antagonists, agreed to make concessions, but not on every point. And when the two men parted, there was a feeling that the toughest bargaining lay ahead in Israel, with Prime Minister Begin, with a government and people that fear to exchange defense advantage for anything less than ironclad guarantees. Still, to Begin and to the Israeli Knesset, the president's message was that only peace brings real security. The talks made some progress, but not enough. And last night came the gloomy announcement that the president was going home today with disagreements still unresolved. But even as that announcement was being made, Foreign Minister Diane was calling on Secretary of State Vance to say, let's try again. And this morning, when Mr. Carter tried again, Prime Minister Begin said yes. Now the departure from Israel was anything but gloomy. Peace was at hand, but not yet in hand. Once more, the president returned to Egypt. And once more, in a meeting at the Cairo airport, Mr. Carter called on Sadat for flexibility, enough to match Begin's yes. The president announced the results.
President Sadat has carefully reviewed all these remaining issues and has accepted these same proposals. I have just informed Prime Minister Begin by telephone of President Sadat's acceptance. I am convinced that now we have defined all of the main ingredients of a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, which will be the cornerstone of a comprehensive peace settlement for the Middle East. Thank you.
It sounded like peace. Could it be true?
Well, does this mean peace, Mr. President? Is it peace? I think I better stick to the statement because it's been approved by President Sadat and by Prime Minister Begin.
But it sounds like peace if the Israeli cabinet agrees. That's correct, said the president.
The president is on his way home tonight, and it appears his mission to the Middle East was a success. The gloom of yesterday has turned into the apparent triumph of today. Here's Peter Jennings in Cairo.
Here in Egypt and in Israel today, President Carter struggled on in search of a Middle East agreement. It has not been easy, but as the president continues his flight home tonight, it may well be that he has overcome. It is not absolutely sure. Prime Minister Begin said tonight 2 remaining problems need to be overcome, but Israel's state radio said flatly that a peace agreement will be signed next week.
Well, they signed it today, and now all they have to do is make it live. A treaty of peace between the Arab Republic of Egypt and the State of Israel. 30 years and 4 wars too late, but today, in what Anwar Sadat has called Jimmy Carter's show, the leaders of Egypt and Israel pledged to make war no more. Standing in front of the flags of the 3 nations, the 3 leaders clasped hands in a moving and emotional display of what this day was all about. Here's our White House correspondent, Sam Donaldson.
They walked through the north portico door of the White House just after 2 p.m. 2 men still technically at war, flanking the mediator who was bringing them to the moment of peace. They walked the few steps to the north lawn, where some 1,200 guests were waiting. They stood for their national anthems, a fresh north wind streaming the flags. Anwar al-Sadat, the Arab who dared to set aside hatred. Menachem Begin, the Jew who dared to set aside suspicion. And Jimmy Carter, the American who refused to give up in the task of bringing them together. Then, with no more fanfare, they signed the documents, including 3 copies of the Treaty of Peace, 1 in Arabic, 1 in Hebrew, a 3rd and controlling copy in English. It was the moment of peace. They shook hands, and they tried to say what it meant.
Today we celebrate a victory, not of a bloody military campaign, but of an inspiring peace campaign. The dedication and determination of these 2 world statesmen have borne fruit. Peace has come to Israel and to Egypt.
The signing of these documents marks only the beginning of peace, but it is an indispensable start. Let there be no more suffering or denial of rights. Let there be no more despair or loss of faith. Let no mother lament the loss of her child. Let no young man waste his life on a conflict from which no one benefits. Let there be no more wars or bloodshed between Arabs and Israelis.
It is a great day in the annals of two ancient nations, Egypt and Israel, whose sons met in battle 5 times in one generation, fighting and falling. Now we make peace. No more war, no more bloodshed, no more bereavement. Peace unto you. Shalom, salam, forever.
Both Begin and Sadat paid effusive tribute to President Carter as the man who performed the miracle. And the president, the ceremony over and his guests departed, went back inside, obviously a truly happy man. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, the White House.
Shakir Abdul Halim, raising his young family in his ancestral village near the Nile, says, "Let peace come," and the Israelis visit his village. The Jews were good traders here once. And if peace brings prosperity, the village needs more electrification, a high school, better water systems. Rural Egypt, just over half the population of 40 million, seems happy about the treaty. At the other extreme, the most visible opposition to the treaty here comes from Muslim fundamentalists. One sermon here in Cairo this weekend openly called for Muslims to fight the Jews, lest this Islamic nation be lost. But these voices are not predominant here. Tonight here in Cairo, no great jubilation nor revolt either as the signing took place in Washington. Most television sets seem to be tuned to the live coverage from the U.S. In the humble Cairo household of Ahmed al-Tawabi, 3 generations watched the ceremony. In Cairo's coffee houses, the regular evening customers watched as their president and 2 other heads of state became momentary focus of the world's attention. As a nation with 5,000 years of unbroken population in the self-contained river valley, Egypt does not face tonight such dramatic national changes as the promise of open borders for the first time is bringing to young modern Israel. The main celebrations here in any case are planned for the day when President Sadat returns from the U.S. For the present, most Egyptians seem to be following the lead of President Sadat when he says that peace should benefit old Egypt, but that it will be a slow process. Bill Blakemore, ABC News, Cairo.
In Egypt, the benefits of peace are slow to come. Opposition to Sadat is growing. Sadat reacts. The day is September 16th, 1981.
What Sadat did in a single blow was arrest and imprison until trial virtually all his threatening opposition, at least 1,536 people, accused as Christian extremists, Muslim extremists, and lawyers, politicians, students, journalists, citizens who have spoken or written or otherwise demonstrated their dissent with Sadat. The catalyst, no one for sure can say. One can only present the theories. To begin with, Sadat himself is a religious man, and yet the biggest group dragged in, well over 1,000 of them, is Muslim extremists, or as they're also known, Islamic fundamentalists. Sadat alienated them nearly 4 years ago when he went to Israel. They oppose peace with Israel. They oppose anything, in fact, with Israel but war. And while it is apparent in Egypt that the peace process has won Sadat the support of most citizens, to the fundamentalists, a Jewish state, by religious law, will always be the enemy, the infidel. The fundamentalists also were a thorn in Sadat's side for their opposition to Western influence in Egypt, namely the influence of American troops, American money, American morality, all of which have established footholds in Egypt today. Little over a month ago, an estimated 100,000 Islamic fundamentalists gathered outside one of President Sadat's residential palaces. With an eye on what happened to the Shah in Iran, Sadat could see that while these people are not considered a majority, they are vocal and they are organized. The other important group put out of commission this month was Citizens with a Forum, lawyers and politicians and journalists and so forth. Now, looking at Egypt today, one can see, and they have complained, that peace with Israel has not brought Sadat's promised prosperity. The Egyptian economy is richer than ever before in modern memory. But to simply look around, all that has filtered down is inflation. Sadat has been attacked for that, and his sensitivity has worn thin. Likewise, in the Arab world, Egypt once was the irrefutable leader. But because of peace with Israel, Egypt today still is the pariah. Sadat has tried at times to rebuild his bridges, earlier this year even selling arms to Iraq. But he and his people remain lonely and isolated. Some of these people have attacked him for that, too. Now, the arrest and exile of Christian extremists on grounds of religious strife is thought by many merely to camouflage Sadat's effort to stifle political dissent. Sadat himself is of fellahin, or peasant stock. He often returns to his native village to reinforce that background, since most of Egypt's 43 million people share it. Last week's referendum on Sadat's crackdown with 99.45% approval seemed to verify their affinity for him.
October 6, 1981. As he had done for 7 years, President Anwar Sadat was in the reviewing stand, presiding over the annual military parade commemorating Egypt's attack on Israel in 1973. The parade was orderly and predictable.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report from ABC News. Now in Washington, here is ABC correspondent Steve Bell.
This is Steve Bell in Washington, and the latest word on Egypt's President Anwar Sadat is that he has in fact been wounded. He is in the hospital. He has been shot 3 times. The latest indicators seem to be that the wounds are not as serious as first believed. Egypt's President Anwar Sadat shot today in Cairo while he was attending a military parade on the 8th anniversary of the October 1973 war. President Sadat and a number of others who were in attendance with him in the reviewing stand were wounded. The shots came from what appeared to be Egyptian soldiers coming out of the back of a military vehicle that had passed in review.
We have had a confirmation from the President's official press spokesman, a man by the name of Sharif Ataya, who says President Sadat is dead. We must attribute this to the official press spokesman, Mr. Sharif Ataya, who told ABC on the phone 5 minutes ago that President Sadat is dead.
I've just been on the phone with Joe Benton, who's at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Senator Percy, the chairman of the committee, opened the meeting by reminding everybody that there is an open line between the embassy, our embassy in Cairo, and the State Department. And Percy said his information is that Sadat is still in stable condition. Takes some adjustment. But there is the announcement from the Vice President, Hosni Mubarak. And you were able to see the dreadful carnage there as these people jumped out of that military vehicle, and then just without any warning at all and any indication that anything like this was going to happen, opened fire and just sprayed the reviewing stand. They got their target. They got Anwar Sadat.
Here with the inside story of that assassination, a moment of crisis, is Tom Jarrell. Tom?
Hugh, the 5 assassins were members of an outlawed Muslim extremist group called Jihad, who, with surprisingly little planning, put together what became one of the most spontaneous assassination plots ever. Their goal, the overthrow of the Egyptian government.
Around 1 p.m., jets streaked overhead, their roar and colorful exhaust grabbing the attention of those in the stands. That was the moment the assassins chose to strike. The entire attack lasted 45 seconds. When it was over, the president of Egypt was dead. Dead, too, were 6 other men. 43 others were wounded. How could President Sadat have been killed, surrounded by the very army he had built up and led? And why had he been killed? Was it a plot? An attempted coup? Were outside forces involved? What pressures in Egypt sparked this radical, suicidal assassination plot? For those of us in the West, Sadat was perceived as a popular leader in his own country. Having achieved peace with Israel, Sadat hoped to finally turn away from war and bring prosperity to Egypt. But in fact, that quest for prosperity, the flood of Western money, and an increasing taste for Western ways only alienated many of his countrymen from Sadat. He was seen as moving too fast, much like the former Shah of Iran, steering Egypt further and further from the foundations of Islam, thereby betraying the ideal of an Islamic state. It was this feeling of religious betrayal that brought together the group that would plan the assassination of Anwar Sadat. 24 men were eventually tried for their role in the plot. Of these, 5 were executed for having been directly responsible for the death of Sadat. The desert was the only safe place where the extremists could train in guerrilla warfare. It was where they kept their weapons.
Out here on the shoulder of a desert highway south of Cairo, various explosives were hidden, including 13 hand grenades. They were dug up from beneath kilometer marker number 80 and delivered to the 4 assassins.
They easily infiltrated the ranks of the Egyptian army. No questions were asked as they presented themselves to the officer in charge. At the same time the 4 assassins were making their final preparations, the man whom they had set out to kill arrived at the reviewing stand for the parade. As was his custom, Sadat was not wearing a bulletproof vest. He was somewhat of a fatalist when it came to protecting himself.
Watching from a glass-enclosed booth, above and behind Sadat, was his wife, Jihan. She could easily see her husband down below in this position on the reviewing stand. She had begged him to wear his bulletproof vest.
Sadat even removed one of his bodyguards from his post directly below because he obscured Sadat's view of the parade. Meanwhile, the trucks of the 333rd Brigade, the brigade that included the 4 assassins, were slowly moving up the line. This is Sadat's private interpreter, Salim Resgala, who was seated in the front row to the president's left.
I found the door of the truck open. A tall, dark young officer shot out of that place, carrying a hand grenade, and I could see him take 2 steps, then turn and hurl that hand grenade. And I could see it fly up in the air. And I could see this grenade actually landed right in front of the wall in front of the reviewing stand. Sadat actually looked to the left because the explosion was to the left, actually, to his left. And I looked to the right. And almost instantly, I found that there were 2 machine guns on the side of the truck, and I found somebody shoot him in the neck. And he dropped.
ABC cameraman Fabrice Moussas was positioned about here in the press section, taping the parade.
As the gunmen were starting to come off the truck and throwing grenades, which were all landing short of the reviewing stand, I took the camera off the tripod, and Ali and I ran towards the reviewing stand. And we're sort of running parallel at the same time, about the same speed as the gunmen.
The 4 assassins advanced quickly toward the stands.
And as they're running, one of them hides behind the Egypt TV camera, which has been left unmanned. The others are already in front of the reviewing stand.
The man behind that camera was the sharpshooter, Hussein. It was his first blast of bullets from the truck that likely killed Sadat. As cameraman Fabrice Moussas and soundman Ali Ashmawi ran toward the stands, they were unknowingly on a collision course with Hussein, who was nearing the steps.
As we came over here, we had to come all the way out here because this area was roped off. Sadat's photographer was protecting himself behind this wall. One of the gunmen at this point turned around 180 degrees and pointed his gun at us. And it's, again, split second, eye contact, a moment of hesitation, and I really thought he was going to shoot us. So we ducked behind this wall right here, okay? And so we were stopped in our run for the podium. I put the camera in front of my face because I really thought he was going to come around and shoot us. And I thought this camera was thick enough it could ricochet a few of the bullets. And it's only 6 seconds, but I think it goes on forever, and I'm dying to keep going. And we got up again, and we go towards the reviewing stand, up the steps, and I can see that Sadat's personal photographer, Mohammed Rashwan, has been killed.
The attack was over in less than a minute. In the chaos and panic on the reviewing stand, The main concern was for Sadat.
As we get to the area where Sadat was sitting, I can see Mubarak and Abu Ghazala, the defense minister, were just getting up. And Sadat is not there. And I remember that I kept shooting, and I kept asking Ali, where is Sadat? Where is Sadat? And we just couldn't find his body.
Sadat's bodyguards, caught off guard during the shooting, had dragged his body from underneath the tangle of chairs just as the shooting stopped. Very probably, Sadat was already dead. There was no coup. Other minor attempts to disrupt the government by revolutionary groups were quickly stopped. So were the assassins. So in the end, who were the men who killed Anwar Sadat? The documents we obtained from their interrogation show they had been deeply influenced by events in Iran, having seen the Shah and his Western-oriented government toppled by men whose prime motive was to return Iran to a religious Islamic state. For the assassins of Anwar Sadat, that ideal gave them the inspiration to push on, to rid themselves and Egypt of the man they thought to be the infidel, Anwar Sadat. Their goal cost them their lives, too. On April 15th, 1982, the five were taken from jail and executed.
Early this morning, in a Cairo suburb not far from the Nile, the funeral ceremonies for Anwar Sadat began. As an ambulance bearing his casket crept the short distance from the military hospital, where he was taken in the futile effort to save his life on Tuesday, to a nearby mosque. Sadat's only son, 24-year-old Gamal, his two brothers, and three sons-in-law led the mourners in the mosque, all of whom were men in accordance with Muslim tradition.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
Though public displays of grief for President Sadat have been noticeably lacking, there were individuals and small groups of people today close enough to the well-guarded ceremonials to be moved at the passing. No hysterical chanting millions to see the casket through the streets of downtown Cairo for Sadat, as there were 11 years ago when Egyptian President Nasser died. The slain president's body today was flown by helicopter to another suburb for the final procession. The Cairo streets, seen on the way to the final ceremony by the guests, who in all numbered about 300 Egyptian and foreign dignitaries along with 500 journalists from around the world, were quiet, some of them empty. Security entering the military parade ground funeral site, where the assassination occurred 4 days ago, was layers deep. No public permitted anywhere near it. The final focus of the ceremony was to be the towering pyramid-shaped tomb of Egypt's unknown soldier, where President Sadat would be laid in a temporary crypt to be moved eventually to a permanent resting place in a mausoleum built for him 200 yards away on the spot at the front of the reviewing stand where he was gunned down. And where the first to arrive today were Mrs. Jahan Sadat, her three daughters, the wives of the late Shah of Iran and the President of the Sudan, and a party of close friends. It's traditional at Muslim funerals often for only the family party to be present at the last moments. It's common at many funerals that the last moments are often overwhelming for those most personally affected. From Islam's Holy Quran, the Muslim preacher sang, "Remember that God created you and God will call you back to him." Anwar Sadat died a controversial leader in Egypt and in the Arab world. He had asked his people to make peace with an old enemy and then keep it. Over his tomb, he got the epitaph he had wanted. President Anwar Sadat, hero of war and peace, who died for his principles. Bill Blakemore, ABC News, Cairo.
It has been 3.5 months since Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated. It was on October 6th, the anniversary of the 1973 Egyptian-Israeli War. And since his funeral, his widow, Jahan Sadat, has not been seen in public. Just last week, Barbara Walters went to Egypt to talk with her, the first time she has spoken out about her husband's death.
The last year, he used to say, Jahan, you know, God was with me during the war. God was with me during the peace initiative. God was with me in everything. I don't want anything more. That's the end of my mission. I don't want anything. I'm preparing myself to meet God.
After the interview was over,
Mrs. Sadat told us of a private tape recording which her husband had made in preparation for his autobiography. She was amazed when she heard it, and we were too. The tape recording was in Arabic, but we had it translated, and here's what it says. The most wonderful thing is that the Lord has fulfilled for me everything I was meant to do on earth. I can now, with all confidence and peace of mind, and everything that makes life beautiful and wonderful, see my end. I have asked the Lord to make my end as fulfilling as he has made my life, and I can see myself approaching this end step by step with my heart and soul full of happiness.